Well, hello friends. I finally came to a point where I finished this damn table, and I'm pretty happy with it. Granted, it caused me a lot of setbacks. I messed up a few times and learned my lessons from them. But this project has been a really good learning lesson. In fact, I've tried a couple new features. These are Danish draw leaves, which are wood mechanisms that slide out and slide back in. The legs on this table are tapered, which I've never done before, and they're also at an angle in the apron. So I'm going to go ahead and start this video. I'll walk you through it, kind of show you where I messed up and how I could have prevented it, and hopefully you learned something that I did too. So cheers. Alright, so I started this project off by cutting down my rough cut slabs that I had here. I pre-measured everything, all my parts out, so I know where I needed to rip these boards down. As you can see in this next slab, I cut through the crotch here because I could use these top two pieces for the tabletop itself, and that bottom piece for legs and the leaves. And I had 3 of these slabs, so I had enough wood to do almost the whole table. I proceeded to run these through the table saw just to get them down to rough dimensions, which would make it easier for me to actually mill these up for all the parts that I needed. So I'm just squaring up the ends here just to make this a little bit easier to process when running through the table saw and the planer, joiner, all that. So I started to plane these boards down, and as I was working through them, I realized that these boards were still going to be way too thick for my tabletop, because my tabletop is actually 2 layers. There's the floating top and then the leaves that actually sit underneath. So when you look at it, it's actually 2 tops stacked on top of each other. And to have a full 1.5 to 2 inch top on top of those leaves, it was going to be way too thick. So once I had these all planed down and looking smooth, I went ahead and took them over to the table saw and started milling them down on the table saw to make this faster. So this process of milling is probably not the best way to do this. However, it's my only option because my bandsaw doesn't have that great of a resaw capability. So what you do here is you raise up your blade, you run it through, you flip your board over the same way, run it through again, raise up your blade, pass after pass after pass. And eventually you get through the entire board, and then you're closer to your thickness of lumber that you actually need. Plus then you have a little extra piece to play with later on. Of course, finishing up the milling process here, taking my tabletop planks and getting them to a final width that will equal out to the perfect width of the tabletop that I need. And here's where I started to screw up. I did not let these boards acclimate to my shop before I started to screw up, which was a big mistake because I ended up having this whole tabletop warp on me and ended up in the end having to rebuild the entire thing. But this is your process, biscuit after biscuit after biscuit, and then glue, 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 and more glue. And the goal here with the biscuits ultimately is just for alignment, to keep the boards all nice and straight together. However, because I didn't let these acclimate, a couple of the boards ended up warping and twisting the whole tabletop, and I was just not able to get that twist out. So this section is actually my leaves. I ended up having to use 2 different sections for the leaves because using a solid slab just didn't have enough. It was too flexible, and I couldn't get it flatted out. So I actually bought this little dowel jig, so I thought I'd give it a shot just to put these leaves together, and it actually worked really well. I used it on the legs too, as you'll see later. So you see here that I learned from my first mistake on my first glue up of the tabletop, and I'm using some cauls here. This will prevent the board from actually warping and keep the glue up flat. At this point, I have most of my parts all done, the leaves glued up, tabletop glued up. I got to the point where I could start trimming things down to the correct size, and I had just picked up this awesome rigid track saw, and man am I so pleased with it. It is so much better than just using a circular saw and a straight edge. It cuts really smooth, works off of the battery packs that I already have. At this point, I was able to start cutting my miters on the apron, just normal 45-degree miters, and they will butt up against the legs and then connect to the legs with the dowels. It was then time to start marking out my legs, so using this template that I made for the rough height and rough shape, I just marked on my wood where I wanted my legs, and then I took it over to the bandsaw and started cutting them out, which worked so nice, and I was very pleased with this technique. So I'm using my joiner to get these nice and squared up. This also brought the leg down to my line and made it a lot easier for final sanding. In order for my apron to get lined up nice and square, I had to make a little square section here on the top of the leg. This also had a nice landing spot for my doweling jig, as I see him doing here. So you see here that I actually am using a little block of wood to raise the doweling jig up. And the reason I did this is because my legs are actually 90 degrees, right? They're squared legs, but I needed a 45-degree hole for my dowels, because these legs actually are going to sit in the apron at a 45-degree angle. The only other way I could have done this is if I actually did a 45-degree taper on the back side of the legs, then I could have properly used this doweling jig, but I didn't like the way that was going to look. Here's the doweling jig actually properly being used. I am just going in at a 90-degree angle into these 45-degree angles, but this will allow this apron to actually be attached to the legs at a 45-degree angle. I then took a round over bit and made these nice and curvy. I really like a round over look. I just think it makes things look really sleek. I know some people like a chamfer over a round over, but I really like the round over. I just think it looks more Danish style and sleek. Just repeating that round over on the apron, but this is actually the underside of the apron, so when you put your hand underneath, you'll actually feel this round over underneath the table. This piece that I'm attaching here is actually the middle brace for the floating top. So what this allows me to do is actually have little brackets underneath the floating tabletop, the actual main tabletop, and this will hold it in place without letting it rack back and forth. I am attaching this with threaded inserts and screws. I probably could have just screwed this into the apron, but for some reason I thought I might need to take it off. But I don't think I actually really needed these threaded inserts on this part of this project. But it does look nice, and it's nice to have the option to take it off if I need to. And now we begin the hardest part of this project, which was making the leaf glides. I had a really hard time at figuring out the angles, the length, the taper, everything. And actually you can see here that I'm using the original tabletop for this project. So there are some holes that were used from the initial tabletop. And I am gluing these up right now because I actually needed stock that was 2.5 inches by 1.5 inches. So then I proceeded to the bandsaw. This taper is a 1-inch taper that goes 22 inches long. And what this allows the tabletop to do is actually pull up to be the same height as the floating top, and then slide down to be underneath the floating top when it's inset. Once again, I used threaded inserts and bolts for these to attach to the leaves. This just allowed me to have a little bit of movement and make sure that they're in the correct position when they're actually attached to the leaves. The next step of this process was to make a dado groove for the glides to actually rest in when they're actually on the table. This allows it to be pulled out and lift up to the correct height and push back down to be underneath the tabletop when they're inset. And here I am just getting the threaded inserts installed onto the leaves. This is obviously a blurry scene, but you can see I'm just using the Forstner bit to get these installed, and then I attach the glides onto the leaf itself. Here's my dry fit on these leaves. I just wanted to give them a nice test fit, make sure that the glides were in the right position, that they were going to pull out, and then I actually had my dados cut at the right dimension too. Then I began the sanding for hours on end, you know, every woodworker's favorite project. I did put a chamfer on these rails here. I thought that would help prevent friction when being pulled in and out, and it actually did really seem to help once I had the entire project done. These are the sections that actually are going to be glued underneath the tabletop. This will sit on that middle brace and allow it from racking back and forth. Cutting out a dado here because this will sit on that bar itself and hold it in place. And I added a round over to these because these will match the leaves when the leaves are actually underneath. So when you look at the table, it's all rounded over all the way through. And then we began the round over on the tabletop itself. I really love the router. The router is probably one of my favorite tools to use. It can be really sketch, but I absolutely love it. I just think it makes projects look finished when you use a router. Finally got to the point where I could actually cut my legs down to the actual size they were going to be. So I just took them over to the chop saw, set up a stop block, and chopped away. Then more sanding, and more sanding. Then I began my glue up of the actual table frame. This was a bit tricky with one person. Luckily, ratchet straps can come in very handy when doing a glue up. And the fact that all these were at 45 degrees helped pretty much. I didn't have any loose ends. Here I am just putting in some blocks that will prevent the table top from racking back and forth. This really shores up your tabletop anytime you build a table frame. This will help out a lot with the racking back and forth. Here I am just screwing in this center support, getting the whole table set up so that I can do my final dry fit on everything before I do my final sanding and finish. Once I had everything positioned where I needed it, I went ahead and added these little blocks that will prevent the top from racking back and forth. Just use some glue and some clamps. I just did some finish rasping here on the dados just to make them nice and squared up. Also allowing a little bit of movement because the glides were actually sitting a little tight at this point. So these are little blocks that I built that will actually go underneath that middle bracket and hold the leaf rails in place and allow them to not rack back and forth. Here I am just cleaning up the tabletop with some mineral spirits before doing my final finish. And I used Rubio Monocoat because I absolutely love this stuff, especially when actually done right, because I've used it before and not done it right. But when it's done right, it is a beautiful matte finish and just really pops that color on the walnut table.
is it. Don't get scared now.
And here's the final reveal with the mechanics. They work really nicely. I'm pretty proud with it. I did have an issue with this tabletop actually acclimating to our house. So it ended up cupping, but I flipped it over and let it settle for a few days, and it actually pulled itself back flat. So it actually ended up being perfect. Here the leaf's getting pulled out, and the tabletop drops down to match the same height as the leaf. And man, I'm pretty pleased with this. There was a lot of learning curves with this, but it turned out awesome, and I would definitely build this table again for a second time. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching. I hope you learned something. Like I said, this project has been one of those projects. I'm really pleased with it. It turned out fantastic. Thank you so much for actually staying to the end. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you on the next video.